The whole point is to live a normal life. And I think one thing to realize is that it is achievable. It is possible to live a normal life through habituation.
George, give us some context first for those who just joined or just watching. Tell us a bit more about your professional career as well as your personal hobbies, a little bit about yourself, and then we'll start with asking the question related to the Tinnitus Triumphs Summit.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dr. Ben. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of your summit. I'm very happy that you invited me to be participating in this. If it can help others, then it's worth doing by all stretch of the imagination. So a little bit about me. I'm an architect. I have a small architectural business in Connecticut, and I do work throughout New England. That's what I do as my day job. And as far as my other passion, and that is fine art photography. So I do all kinds of abstract photography, as well as nature, travel, and I also wind up doing a lot of presentations for the community on a whole series of topics, both regional conferences as well as local small groups. So that's, in a nutshell, a little bit of background as to who I am.
Busy man with some fun interests and very community oriented as well. So,
Yeah.
all right, let's ask the first question. Where are you today regarding your tinnitus? How loud is it? How much does it affect you? Let's say in the last week, what kind of tinnitus are you experiencing in the last week, if any?
Okay, so right now where I am at, I would say that my perceived level of tinnitus for the sound is between a 2 and a 3, and that's only when I think about it. When I don't think about it, I'm not even aware of it. So I can pretty much go for hours at a time and not be thinking about tinnitus. So it's an automatic thing. If I give it a thought, then I can see it. I can tell it it's there, but it does not bother me. So I think I've come a long way from where I was back in April of 2021 when it all started.
Let's go over that journey. So you just gave us a snapshot of where you are today. When we met, you were not in this place. When we met, you were along your journey. Tell us about the most challenging parts of the beginning, when things started to get serious. Tell us, what were you experiencing? And I know that part of our audience will be able to relate to those symptoms.
Sure. So I believe my story is very similar to so many thousands of other people that have gone through this. But as I said, it started back in April of 2021. I did the same thing like everyone. I went to my audiologist, ENT, series of tests, did find out to my surprise that I had some hearing loss in the higher frequencies, which I guess happens to a lot of people. The tests otherwise turned out okay. My ENT basically said, you're stuck with it. No cure. I just need to learn to live with it. I remember that phrase, and it was devastating because I remember driving home feeling pretty lousy after hearing that, saying, how can I live with this the rest of my life? So the first 3 months, that was the stressful time. I would say that my tinnitus level was a constant between 9 and 10, with 10 being the worst. So it was definitely a stressful 3 months, lack of sleep, a lot of the things that many people experience, and it was not so great. And the first thing I did was, based on my ENT's recommendation, to find some help. At the time I didn't know of your group. It was, and so I found a local therapy group in Connecticut. And it wasn't easy to find, but I did find a therapist that was able to help me at first with one-on-one weekly sessions. That was my first exposure to cognitive behavioral therapy, which I will admit I never even heard of before that time. I never had a need for it. So, so with that, stress reduction techniques, all those things, and I'll talk about that later when I talk about habituation. But I took a lot of extensive notes, tracking lessons learned, and so on. And eventually that turned to biweekly. And after about 3 months, it eventually ended. Overlapping with the second half of that period is when I discovered your videos. And I was thrilled to see how many there were on YouTube even back then. I would say that was somewhere around summer of 2021.
This is a short interruption from today's video to announce the tinnitus quiz. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you or someone you know has tinnitus. We know how much tinnitus can impact your daily life, and we're here to help. Visit tinnitusquiz.com and take a 2-minute quiz to receive personalized treatment plans that have helped hundreds of people learn to manage their tinnitus. Start now at tinnitusquiz.com.
Okay, you mentioned earlier, hey, you're an architect, you have a small business you're running, you have these hobbies, you're even giving presentations about your photography. I imagine your job requires a lot of focus and sometimes there's stress. So talk to us about how did tinnitus affect you day to day, hour to hour, personal or professional life?
Sure, it was terrible. It affected my focus because primarily because of the lack of sleep. Because I didn't get my sleep, I couldn't focus on my architectural work. So fortunately, I have a good staff that I could depend on, and so they handled a lot of the day-to-day stuff, and I managed to do what I had to do minimally. But it was definitely a challenge, and so yeah, it definitely affected me. I cut back on my photography at the time, but I also learned pretty quickly from the therapy sessions that one must do what you love to do and not stop doing that, because that is one way of helping to get better, basically.
Yes, so you're painting a good picture here. Obviously, this was a big pain. This was creating a lot of difficulty. What did you find along the journey that allowed you to improve? And then we're going to touch on this theme of how habituation works. I want to present the 4 stages, which will anchor us into
Hmm.
this framework here. So just
Right.
start talking first about really like what were some things that you found or that you did that allowed you to improve.
Okay, so basically, I find that to habituate, it's a proactive approach that balances mindset, positive attitude, and integrative strategies. So the first thing was stress reduction. I found that the slow breathing to become more calm, activating the parasympathetic nervous system. I did meditation, and I did that twice a day, morning and evening. At evening, especially, it would help me fall asleep. I used apps for that, for guided type meditations, as well as focusing on the breath, body scans, all those kinds of meditations, and all about the mindfulness of being able to learn to be aware of my thoughts and separating myself from the tinnitus, not allowing it to control me. One of the things I learned from one of your meditations in the series that you did is that I am not tinnitus. It's not going to control my life. And one has to really understand how important that is, because you can't let it totally absorb your every part of your being. And so allowing one to relax, using walks in natural settings, tuning in with the sounds and sights of the natural environment, those kinds of strategies were the kinds of things I was doing in the beginning to just get myself past the fright and flight kind of stage one. I needed to get out of that as quickly as possible. So once I started to do all this, and also the group coaching that you were doing, I was doing that monthly. I was learning a lot of education about tinnitus retraining therapy, neuroscience, and strategies for habituation, but also listening to everyone's stories and providing support. So all of that, in an integrative way, helped inform me about what this is all about and what I need to do to be proactive about letting this process go as smoothly as possible, rather than just waiting for years and years and letting it take its time.
Mm.
I was too
I,
impatient
I
for that.
I know that when we met and when I had some conversations with you, you were always very logical and systems oriented and trying to solve the problem by learning about the different tools and
Mhm.
avenues that can actually provide help. And I felt like that was a very
Mm.
comprehensive approach. We're going to now jump into the 4 stages of relief here, the 4 stages of habituation. Right before we do, you mentioned earlier there were periods where this tinnitus was really bad, quite frankly. How loud would you have rated it between 1 and 10, 1 being not a problem at all, 10 being an extreme problem? What kind of tinnitus were you dealing with in terms of the intensity or the loudness?
Those first 3 months, I was running between 9 and 10 pretty much regularly every day. Sometimes it would drop down to an 8, and I would get a little bit of relief. But it was definitely up there in the 9 to 10 range, where it was driving me nuts. I was driving my wife nuts, and so yeah, it was about as bad as it could be.
Sorry to hear that, but of course, glad that you're better. Now, in terms of the awareness of the sound, what percentage of waking hours, daytime hours, were you aware of the sound when it was a 9 or a 10?
I
50%, 80%?
I would say 90, 80, 90%.
Okay. So you're showcasing here a very serious problem and something
Yes.
that I know our audience, some of whom can relate of this was a persistent, ever present sound that no matter how hard you tried day to day, it wasn't really letting off. Is that fair to say?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to jump into the 4 stages of relief here. Knowing that you are now at a 2 or a 3, you used to be a 9 or a 10. I'm sure everyone wants to know, what did you do? But to get there, you've alluded to some of those tools, and obviously finding us was a part of that, as well as other things you did on your own. Let's now bring in this reference of the 4 stages of habituation, what we also describe as the 4 stages of relief. So did you work with your audiologist in reference to these 4 stages? And could you walk us through your experience of the timeline of how this habituation process works, please, George?
Well, I think, a lot of it was during the coaching period. And I think I was going through the stage 2 pretty much during the coaching. When I started working with Dr. Tracy Halcomb, one of the audiologists, I think I was more in the stage 3 at that point. And what she did is to help me go through the specifics of each one of these and sort of identify where I was at, kind of giving me a very direct personal approach. So whereas the coaching is good in a general sense, the one-on-one is so important that I don't think I would have achieved the type of speed in which I was able to improve without that one-on-one. So that was very, very useful.
All right. So stage 1, highest awareness and annoyance of tinnitus throughout the day, frequent worrying and anxiety, often accompanied by loss of sleep. How many months or weeks would you say you were in this stage 1?
3 months.
Okay. And then you use some tools, just touching on those again. There was some help from CBT, there was some help with sound therapy, and then mindfulness. Is that fair to summarize in that way?
Correct. Yes. And so this is before I started using sound therapy. So I was using primarily CBT, stress management, meditation, mindfulness, those kinds of things. So that, and also that what that did was it helped me get back on track with my sleep. So I was able to get back to a point where I could fall asleep without any problem. And that was so important. That was maybe the next 2 months, let's say, for stage 2 to start to get better. Also, my focus was improving. My appetite was coming back. I did lose maybe 12 pounds, but I gained that back. I also started exercising, which I didn't mention, but I'm on a 2 to 3 times a week rigorous exercising, which really makes you feel so much better. It's whether you have tinnitus or not, it is so important. Diet, cutting out processed sugar, all those kinds of things. So I was doing all these things where I think I'm healthier now than I was pre-tinnitus. So
understood. And then you mentioned that sound therapy was a part of your toolkit. You added that at some point.
Yes, once. Yeah, I didn't really understand how sound therapy could do so much, but once I learned about it and understood generally how it works, basically helping the brain to put the tinnitus in the back on the back shelf and sort of rewiring the internal circuitry, I started to use the maskers on I have hearing aids in both ears. And so it has the built-in masker. So I use that a few hours a day, 2 to 3, sometimes 4 hours a day. Sometimes I just forget that it's on, and it's on for like maybe 6 hours. And other days I forget to turn it on because I'm just focused on other things. I also use the Oasis sound machine at night. I put it on every night, and it helps me fall asleep. And if I wake up in the middle of the night, it's very soothing to hear that sound machine. It took a while to find the sound that I like. It's sort of a pink noise, and so it sounds like a waterfall, and that's what helps. So yeah, I still use that every day.
Excellent. That was a good summary. So, in your opinion, how does habituation work? Talk to us about the focus, the attention.
Yeah.
Is habituation something that you do, or is it something that sort of happens when you set up the right tool? Tell us more about how habituation works in your eyes.
It's a little bit of both, because I use the word proactive. If you just let it sort of happen on its own, it's not going to happen so quickly. It might take a really long time. So I think being consciously aware of the conscientious use of integrating all of the things that I've been talking about every day. I think it's especially in those first 3 to 6 months or 8 months, it's something that I was thinking about on a daily basis. And the one other thing I want to mention, which is so important, I learned this in the early therapy, and I use this even today, outlining insights. So I keep a list, and this list, basically, it's a 1-page outline that describes the insights that are reminders to reinforce understanding for me as to what's going on. it also helps one.
What are those core insights for you, George? Those things that you would always come back to keep you aligned on this path?
Some of them are mindful ones, such as telling myself that I will get better, that I'm not going to succumb to the T word, that it's not going to overpower me. And that's sort of a self-empowering kind of an understanding. Being aware of the sense of well-being and striving to achieve that. So yeah, mindfulness, I think for me, I don't know how for others, but for me that worked in a big way to set the mind. That starts with the mind, really. I mean, you can do a lot of other kinds of things like diet and exercise and even sound therapy. But if your mind isn't there, it just, I think, is more difficult. So it's using that approach of positivity, that it doesn't happen by itself.
And now today, would you say that you're at stage 4 where tinnitus is rarely noticed? You can quickly redirect your attention from it and it no longer elicits automatic negative feelings or thoughts?
Yes, I can say that. It doesn't bother me. Just looking at it's really, yeah, it's really noticed unless I'm thinking about it. If I do think about it and I notice it, I am able to redirect attention away from it very easily. In fact, if I'm lying in bed at night, especially in the early months, if I was being bothered by the sound, I would just start focusing on some of the creative arts kind of stuff, goals, aspirations, planning out things that I was going to be working on for projects. And that would take my mind off of it. So it's redirecting focus. And that is easy for me to do. I have no problem being able to redirect my thinking. Also, yeah, I can easily forget about it. And there is an emotional acceptance as I'm reading through the list on the stage 4. It does not elicit any negative feelings or thoughts. So I don't have any of that. So I would say I'm at stage 4. I'm not saying it's perfect, because there are times when, if I'm having a little bit of a challenging day, a little like a deadline for a project, then, it might set itself off, but it doesn't last for more than maybe an hour. And then I can get back to earth.
George has shared some tactical advice. I mean, I think we can all just sense the calmness in his voice, where clearly he's doing a lot better, and the tinnitus is not, day to day causing a lot of anxiety and stress, because to me, George, you sound very calm and in a good place of health and wellness. So I'm glad to hear that. Let's open it up for questions. Garrett, I know there was one question in the chat. Would you be able to get us started by relaying that question, please?
Sure thing. And hello, George. Thanks for sharing your wisdom tonight.
Thank
Mike,
you.
Absolutely. Mike asks, George, are there any lessons learned, things you would have done differently, knowing what you know now, that you can share with the rest of us?
Yes, I think I wish I had found Treble Health earlier instead of in my 4th or 5th month. If I could have found it a little bit earlier, I think that would have been a lot more beneficial for me. As far as would I do anything different? I don't. Well, let me put it this way: from beginning to the point where I felt where I was getting to a point where I was pretty happy with myself. And that was around the end of the time when I didn't have to do any more one-on-one with Dr. Tracy Halcomb. That was 14 months. So that was my, I know that question comes up a lot. How long does it take? And it could vary so much, but for me it was 14 months. And I think that's pretty decent comparatively. I know for some it might be less, someone might be a lot more, but the whole point is to live a normal life. And I think one thing to realize is that it is achievable. It is possible to live a normal life through habituation.
George, I know that was one of the main takeaways when we spoke, and that really stuck with me. You mentioned this phrase of living a full and productive life, and you're right, that is the goal. And tinnitus does not need to go to 0 for us to achieve that goal. What is your opinion on this in the process here? Is there sometimes this thought of, oh, I need this to go away for me to be happy? Tell me about your experience there of, okay, it's milder, I still have it, but I am living a full and productive life.
Sure, that's a really good question, because it recalls something for me in the early months where I was afraid that it would never go back to 0, and that was terrifying. It really, really terrified me that I'll never be normal again. And as time went on, and I went through the process of habituating and managed to get down to, as I said, to a 2 and a 2 to 3, I'm very grateful to be at the 2 to 3, considering that I was at a 9, 10 in the early days. So I'm not disappointed in that. And if it never goes back down to a 1 or a 0, it's not the end of the world. I can live a normal life even with the 2 to 3 because it just doesn't bother me.
We have one last question here, George. The question is, how did you know it was time to stop using the sound therapy in your ears through the devices?
Well, the truth is I have not stopped using sound therapy. I still use it every day. I hope I didn't mislead anyone. I use it every day because I want to maintain the level that I'm at. I don't want to, I don't know if it's possible to go back down the rabbit hole or go down the despairing spiral kind of thing, but I don't want to let that happen. So I'm perfectly happy to continue using the hearing aid maskers. I don't use it as often as I did. Maybe I'm using it maybe 75 or 60% of the time, but I still like to have it there when it's it. But at night it's always on because I've just gotten used to it. I've gotten used to listening to it. My wife doesn't mind it. She likes to listen to it as well. My dogs like it. So there's nothing that says that I have to stop using them. It's actually very soothing because I happen to love waterfalls. And as I've told you before, I've photographed many waterfalls, especially in Iceland where there are so many to photograph. So I just love waterfalls.
Excellent. Well, let's give a round of applause here for George. George, our gratitude. Thank you for sharing your story, for being here and giving some hope and inspiration to others. I think some key points in your story that habituation takes time, that it's a compounding effect. And when you put all of the tools that work together, it can dramatically improve the situation. And, to go from a 9 out of 10 for months down to a 2 or a 3 and full and productive life. I mean, that is the exact message of this Tinnitus Triumphs Summit.